The Velkari had ruled the stars for 3,000 years. They were old when most species were still learning to walk on two legs. They were powerful when empires rose and fell like waves on a beach. And they were patient, always patient. They stood 8 feet tall, covered in dark shells that clicked when they moved. Their eyes were black pools that showed nothing. No warmth, no mercy, no doubt. They had learned long ago that the universe was simple. The strong took what they wanted, the weak gave it to them, and fear was the chain that kept everything in order. The Velkari did not believe in kindness. They did not believe in fairness. They believed in results, and fear always gave them results. When they found a new species, they did not try to make friends. They did not offer trade or knowledge or partnership. They simply showed that species what happened to those who refused to obey. 1 city would burn, 1 million would die, and then the talking would begin. It always worked. Every species broke eventually. Some took days, some took years, but they all broke. The Velkari had conquered 47 different races across 600 worlds using this same simple method. Fear was cheap. Fear was efficient. Fear lasted for generations. When human ships first appeared at the edge of Velkari space, the High Council studied them carefully. Humans were small and soft. They lived short lives. They had only recently learned to travel between stars. They were weak in every way that mattered. The Council classified them as a manageable primitive species and assigned them a modest planet called New Meridian. It was a decent world with breathable air and drinkable water. The Velkari were not cruel without purpose. Happy workers produced more than miserable ones, but the workers needed to understand their place. So the Velkari taught them. The first lesson came quickly. A human named Robert Shaw spoke at a public gathering. He said that humans deserved representation in hegemony affairs. He said that humans had rights. The next morning, Robert Shaw was hanging from the central tower of the capital city. His wife hung beside him. His children hung beside her. His parents, his siblings, his cousins. 23 people died because one man spoke words the Velkari did not like. The humans learned to be quiet. The second lesson came a year later. A group of young humans refused to work in the mineral mines. They said the conditions were unsafe. They said their friends had died. The Velkari did not negotiate. They did not compromise. They simply selected one worker from every family in that district and executed them in the public square. Not the workers who had complained, their families. The humans learned to work without complaint. The third lesson was the silence decree. Any human who spoke against the hegemony would vanish, but they would not vanish alone. 3 generations of their bloodline would vanish with them. Parents, children, grandchildren, all gone, not killed publicly, just gone, no bodies, no graves, no closure. The humans learned to fear even their own thoughts. For 40 years, this system worked perfectly. The Velkari observers on New Meridian sent back glowing reports. Humans responded to fear stimuli better than any species they had ever encountered. Production quotas were met. Resistance was non-existent. The human population grew slowly, worked hard, and never caused trouble. The reports used words like docile and compliant and fully pacified. The observers were pleased with their work. They had turned a potentially troublesome species into perfect servants. They never bothered to study human history. If they had, they might have learned about the centuries of war humans had waged against each other. They might have learned about the empires that had risen through terror and fallen through revolution. They might have learned about the human capacity for patience, for planning, for revenge. But the Velkari believed they already understood everything they needed to know. Humans were afraid. Afraid beings did not fight back. This was the natural law of the universe, proven across 3,000 years of conquest. On New Meridian, humans went about their daily lives. They worked in the mines and the factories and the farms. They bowed when Velkari patrols passed by. They kept their eyes down and their voices low. They followed every rule, no matter how harsh. But in the darkness of their homes, they whispered. They remembered the names of those who had been taken. They passed stories to their children about a blue planet called Earth where humans had once been free. They kept records of every death, every disappearance, every cruelty. They taught their children to remember. And they waited. A man named Chen Wei had survived the execution of his entire extended family when he was 17 years old. His crime had been sharing a book with his cousin, a book about human history. He had hidden in a drainage pipe for 3 days while the Velkhari searched for him. When he finally emerged, he had nothing left. No family, no home, no future. He built a new life slowly. He married a woman named Lin who had lost her parents to the Silence Decree. They had a son named James. They taught him to smile at the Velkhari and hate them in his heart. They taught him to be patient, to remember, to wait. James grew up and married a woman named Sarah. They had a daughter named Lily. She was born with her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn spirit. She was curious about everything. She asked questions that made her parents nervous. She did not understand why humans had to bow. She did not understand why they had to be afraid. She was 7 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. The Velkhari observers noted in their reports that the human population on New Meridian had grown to 12 million. Production remained steady. Compliance remained perfect. There were no signs of unrest, no indications of trouble. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. They did not know that they were sitting on a bomb. They did not know that 40 years of terror had not broken the humans. It had only compressed them, hardened them, turned their fear into something else entirely. All it would take was one spark. Grandmother Lin kept a garden at the edge of the human district. It was a small patch of earth, no bigger than a bedroom. But in that tiny space she had worked a miracle. Real earth roses grew there, red and pink and white. They had come from seeds smuggled across the stars, passed down through generations like sacred treasures. The garden sat close to the enforcement zone where Velkhari patrols walked day and night. It was a dangerous place to grow flowers, but Lin had planted them there on purpose. She wanted something beautiful to exist right next to something ugly. She wanted to prove that the Velkhari could not crush everything. Her husband Wei had been gone for 3 years now, taken in the night for reasons no one ever explained. Lin had not cried when they came for him. She had simply held his hand until they pulled him away. Then she had gone back to her garden and planted another rose. Lily loved visiting her grandmother. She loved the smell of the flowers and the feel of dirt between her fingers. She loved the stories Lin told about Earth, about oceans so big you could not see the other side, about forests that went on forever, about a time when humans answered to no one. On the day everything changed, Lily had come to help her grandmother water the roses. It was a warm afternoon. The twin suns of New Meridian hung low in the purple sky. Lin was tired that day. Her back hurt and her hands shook, but she smiled when she saw Lily running toward her. They worked together in comfortable silence. Lin showed Lily how to check the soil, how to trim the dead leaves, how to talk to the plants so they would grow strong. Lily listened carefully. She wanted to be a gardener like her grandmother someday. As the afternoon grew late, Lily noticed something. One of the roses had grown beyond the garden's edge. It had pushed through the small fence and bloomed on the other side, in the enforcement zone. It was the most beautiful rose Lily had ever seen. Deep red like blood, like fire, like the sunset on Earth in grandmother's stories. Lin had gone inside to rest. Lily looked at the rose. She looked at the invisible line that separated the human district from the enforcement zone. She did not understand why a line on the ground mattered. She did not understand why she could not pick a flower. She was 7 years old. She only knew that the flower was beautiful, and that grandmother had been sad for so long. Lily stepped over the line. She reached down and picked the rose. She held it up to smell it. The Velkari enforcer appeared from nowhere. He was young for his kind, only 300 years old. He had been assigned to this patrol route as punishment for a minor failure. He hated this planet. He hated these weak, soft creatures. He wanted to be anywhere else. When he saw the human child standing in the enforcement zone, he did not think. He did not ask questions. He did not consider that she was just a little girl picking a flower. He only saw a violation, a rule being broken, a chance to prove himself worthy of better assignments. The neural spike was designed for adult insurgents. It delivered enough electrical charge to paralyze a full-grown human male. When it hit Lily Chen, who weighed less than 50 pounds, it stopped her heart instantly. She fell without a sound. The rose dropped from her fingers. Her eyes stayed open, staring at the purple sky she would never see again. The enforcer looked at the small body on the ground. He felt nothing. He filed a routine report on his communication device. Juvenile asset neutralized for territorial violation. No strategic value. Recommends standard disposal. He did not notice the man watching from behind a broken wall. Marcus Webb was a dock worker with gray in his hair and scars on his hands. He had come to the edge of the district to trade goods with a friend. Now he stood frozen, his salvaged datapad held in trembling fingers. He had recorded everything. Marcus did not run. He did not scream. He did not do anything that would draw attention. He simply walked away with steady steps and a face that showed nothing. Inside his pocket, the datapad held a video that would change the galaxy forever. That night he showed it to his wife. She covered her mouth and wept. He showed it to his brother. His brother showed it to his work crew. They showed it to their families. Within 6 hours, every human on New Meridian had seen the video. They saw a little girl with flowers in her hair reach down to pick a rose. They saw the flash of the neural spike. They saw her fall. They saw the enforcer step over her body and walk away without looking back. By morning, the video had spread to human communities on other worlds. Human workers on mining stations and cargo ships and factory planets gathered around tiny screens and watched a 7-year-old girl die for picking a flower. No one spoke, no one needed to. Lynn found her granddaughter's body when she went to close the garden gate for the night. She knelt beside Lily in the dirt and held her small, cold hand. She did not cry. She had no tears left. She had used them all up years ago. She sat there until morning, holding her granddaughter and looking at the rose that still lay in the dirt, red like blood, red like fire. When James and Sarah came to find their daughter, they found Lynn still sitting there, still silent, still holding on. James looked down at his daughter's face. He had taught her to smile at the Velkari. He had taught her to keep her head down. He had taught her all the rules that were supposed to keep her safe. None of it had mattered. The Velkari had killed her anyway, for a flower. Something broke inside James Chen that morning, but it was not his spirit. It was not his hope. It was something else, something that had been holding him back for his entire life. It was his fear. He picked up his daughter's body and carried her home. Behind him, the sun rose over New Meridian. A new day was beginning. The last day of the old world. The Velkari had protocols for everything. They had spent 3,000 years conquering and controlling. They had seen every type of rebellion, every kind of resistance, every form of anger a species could show. They expected riots. When a population became angry, they rioted. They burned buildings. They attacked patrols. They screamed and fought and died in the streets. It was messy but predictable. The Velkari would respond with overwhelming force. They would kill hundreds to save millions. The anger would burn itself out within days. Order would return. This was how it always worked. This was how it was supposed to work. But the humans did not riot. The morning after Lily Chen died, humans across New Meridian reported to their assigned positions. They walked to the mines and the factories and the farms. They put on their work clothes. They picked up their tools. And then they stopped talking. Not just to the Velkhari, to everyone, to each other. Mothers did not speak to children. Workers did not speak to supervisors. Friends passed each other in the streets without a word. The entire human population went silent. At first, the Velkhari observers thought it was a strange mourning custom. They made notes in their reports about primitive grief rituals and temporary emotional dysfunction. They expected it to pass within a few days. But the silence continued, and then the accidents began. On Station Velkhar 7, a power coupling in the administrative quarter suffered what engineers called material fatigue. The official report said the part had simply worn out after years of use. These things happened. Maintenance schedules were updated. Life went on. Except the part had been inspected 2 days earlier by a human technician named David Park. He had worked on Velkhari stations for 20 years. He knew every system better than the Velkhari themselves. His inspection report said the coupling was in perfect condition. When the coupling failed, atmospheric containment in the administrative quarter collapsed in seconds. 200 Velkhari officials died before emergency systems could respond. The human workers in the neighboring sections were unharmed. They had been on the other side of a blast door that someone had quietly closed 5 minutes before the failure. David Park expressed appropriate regret at the investigation. His face showed nothing. His voice was steady. The investigators found no evidence of sabotage. 3 days later, a hegemony supply convoy jumped to the wrong coordinates. The navigation computer had been programmed with numbers that were off by just enough to put the ships directly in the path of an asteroid field. All 8 ships were destroyed. 40,000 tons of supplies meant for Velkhari military outposts were lost. The human navigation officer who had entered the coordinates was already dead. He had walked into an airlock the day before and opened it. His final message said only, "For Lily." A week after that, Commander Velthar of the 3rd Enforcement Division was traveling to a meeting on New Meridian. His personal transport suffered engine failure during atmospheric entry. The ship came apart at 50,000 feet. There were no survivors. The human maintenance crew had serviced the ship the night before. Their work logs showed nothing unusual. Every system had been tested and verified. The chief mechanic, a woman named Rosa Santos, had signed off on the final inspection. When questioned, she said all the right things. She showed all the right emotions. But her daughter had been Lily Chen's best friend. The Velkhari High Council received daily reports about the growing number of accidents. Each incident was investigated. Each investigation found nothing. Equipment failed. Computers made errors. Ships went to the wrong place. These things happened in any large operation. But they did not happen like this. Not this many, not this fast. Ambassador Telvex was the hegemony's leading expert on human psychology. He had spent decades studying the species. He had written the original classification report that called them docile and manageable. Now he requested an emergency audience with the council. He stood before the 12 highest leaders of the Velkhari hegemony and told them they had made a terrible mistake. "We assumed humans feared death," he said. "They do not. They fear losing what they love, their families, their children, their freedom. We have spent 40 years threatening these things to keep them under control." He paused. The council waited. "But now we have shown them that obedience does not protect what they love. We have killed a child who broke no real rule, a child whose family followed every law we imposed. We have demonstrated that our threats are not promises. They are certainties." Telvex's voice was quiet now. "We have removed their reason to comply. We have removed their reason to be afraid. And humans without fear are not docile. They are not manageable. They are something else entirely." The council demanded to know what he recommended. Telvex had no answer. For the first time in his long career, he did not know what to do. Across human space, the silence continued. Humans worked, humans smiled, humans bowed when Velkari patrols passed by. And somewhere, in the dark corners of stations and ships and cities, they planned. They shared information through codes hidden in work orders. They passed messages written in languages the Velkari had never bothered to learn. They identified targets. They studied weaknesses. They waited for the right moment. The Velkari had spent centuries building an empire on fear. They had never considered what would happen when their subjects stopped being afraid. They were about to find out. The Velkari began to search human records. For the first time in 40 years, they wanted to understand the species they had conquered. They read human history files. They studied human wars. They examined human behavior across thousands of years. What they found terrified them. Humans had spent most of their existence trying to destroy each other. They had invented weapons that could level cities. They had developed poisons that could kill millions. They had created bombs that split atoms and turned matter into fire. And they had used all of these things on themselves. The Velkari read about a city called Stalingrad. During a war called World War II, humans had fought over this single city for 6 months. They had fought in frozen streets and burning buildings. They had fought until they ran out of bullets and used knives. They had fought until they ran out of food and ate rats and leather and worse. 900,000 humans died fighting for one city. Neither side surrendered. The Velkari did not understand. Their species abandoned positions when the cost became too high. It was logical. It was efficient. Why would anyone die for a piece of ground? They read about something called the Resistance. During the same war, humans in conquered territories had refused to accept defeat. They had formed secret networks that operated for years under the eyes of their enemies. They had passed messages through coded songs and hidden newspapers. They had taught their children to lie with straight faces. They had died by the thousands, but they had never stopped fighting. The Velkari found records of human philosophers who had written about resistance and freedom and martyrdom. One human named Patrick Henry had said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Another named Nelson Mandela had spent 27 years in a prison cell rather than renounce his beliefs. Humans seemed to consider dying for a cause to be the highest honor. But the most disturbing discovery was the concept of revenge. Velkari experienced anger as a brief chemical reaction. It improved combat performance for a few minutes, then faded. Rational thought returned. Cost-benefit analysis resumed. This was how all intelligent species worked. Humans were different. Humans could hold anger for decades. They could nurse it like a fire, feeding it with memories and grief. They could pass it to their children and their children's children. They had a word for conflicts that lasted generations. Blood feuds. A human could smile at an enemy for 20 years, while planning that enemy's destruction. The Velkari High Council called an emergency session. They needed to respond to the growing chaos. Ships were failing. Stations were breaking. Officials were dying in accidents that fooled no one. The human resistance was invisible and everywhere. Commander Yuki Tanaka had waited her entire life for this moment. Her great-grandfather had been a teacher. He had taught human children to read and write and think for themselves. For this crime, the Velkari had vaporized him along with his entire classroom. 43 people had died because one man believed children should learn to read. Yuki's grandmother had told her the story when she was 5 years old. She had made Yuki memorize her great-grandfather's name. She had made her promise to never forget. Yuki had not forgotten. She had spent 30 years working as a cleaning technician. She had mopped floors and emptied trash in Velkari administrative buildings. She had smiled and bowed and made herself invisible. No one noticed a cleaning woman. No one watched where she went or what she touched. Over those 30 years, she had mapped every security system in the regional headquarters. She had memorized patrol schedules. She had identified structural weaknesses. She had slowly, carefully smuggled components past scanners that were not designed to detect human technology. The bomb took 15 years to build. Pieces came from 100 different sources. Human workers across a dozen facilities contributed parts that meant nothing by themselves. Only Yuki knew how they fit together. On the morning of her attack, Yuki put on her cleaning uniform and walked to work. She smiled at the Velkari guards. She showed them her identification card. They waved her through without a second glance. She was still smiling when she pressed the detonator. The explosion killed 412 Velkari officials. It destroyed the entire security headquarters. It sent a message that could not be ignored. Nowhere was safe. The humans who had helped build the bomb knew they would be discovered. They knew the Velkari would trace the components and find them. They did not try to hide. When the enforcers came, they found a group of humans sitting together in a room. On the wall, someone had written a list of names. Every human who had been taken or killed over the past 40 years. At the bottom of the list in fresh paint, someone had added, Lily Chen, age 7. The enforcers killed them all, but more names went on more walls. More bombs were built. More accidents happened. The Velkari had believed that killing leaders would end resistance. They had believed that eliminating troublemakers would restore order. They had believed that enough death would break the human spirit. They had not understood that every death only added fuel to the fire. Every martyr became a symbol. Every name became a reason to keep fighting. Humans did not resist despite their losses. They resisted because of them. The war lasted 18 months, but it was not a war in any sense the Velkari understood. There were no front lines, no armies marching across battlefields, no fleets clashing in the darkness between stars. There were only humans going about their daily lives, working their jobs, following their routines, and destroying the hegemony from the inside. Human engineers who had maintained Velkari ships for decades knew exactly which parts to weaken. They knew which systems would fail at the worst possible moment. They knew how to make accidents look like accidents. Human workers in food processing facilities introduced compounds into Velkari supplies. These chemicals were harmless to every other species in the galaxy. But Velkari biology had a weakness that humans had discovered through years of quiet observation. Within 3 months, food shortages crippled military operations across half the empire. Human translators who had served Velkari diplomats provided their masters with precise translations, but the translations were designed to cause offense. Ancient enemies of the hegemony received messages that insulted their traditions. Neutral species received threats that pushed them toward rebellion. Allies received words that made them question their partnership. The Velkari diplomatic network, built over centuries, collapsed in weeks. On 100 worlds, other species watched what the humans were doing. These races had been conquered and controlled just like humanity. They had lived under Velkari rule for generations. They had forgotten what it meant to be free. Now they remembered. A species called the Torvax had been slaves for 800 years. They saw humans tear apart their masters and found courage they had lost long ago. They rose up on their homeworld and killed every Velkari enforcer in a single night. The Maridani had been conquered before humans existed. They had accepted their fate as permanent. Then they watched a race that had been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries bring the hegemony to its knees. They began to believe in possibilities they had stopped imagining. One by one, subject races across the empire joined the rebellion. The Velkari tried to respond with their usual methods. They tried mass executions. They tried collective punishment. They tried to make examples. But fear only works when people believe obedience will save them. The humans had proven that obedience saved nothing. The other races had learned the lesson. Admiral James Chen commanded the human fleet from a converted cargo ship. He had never been a military man. Before his daughter died, he had worked in water treatment. He had fixed pipes and tested samples, and never imagined he would lead anyone into battle. But Lily's death had changed him. It had changed everything. He had studied human military history. He had learned from generals and admirals who had fought against impossible odds. He had taken their lessons and applied them to a war unlike any humans had ever fought. The final battle took place above the Valkyrie homeworld. What remained of the hegemony fleet made its last stand there. 300 ships against the combined forces of humanity and its allies. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Valkyrie fleet had been reduced to debris drifting in space. The High Council sent a message requesting terms of surrender. They offered to release all human prisoners. They offered to withdraw from all human territories. They offered reparations that would take centuries to pay. Admiral Chen read the message in silence. Around him, his officers waited. They had all lost someone to the hegemony. They had all spent years watching their people suffer and die. Chen thought about his daughter. He thought about the rose she had picked. He thought about the video that had started everything. A little girl reaching for a flower, a flash of light, a small body falling. He thought about 40 years of fear, 40 years of bowing, 40 years of watching families disappear in the night. His response was broadcast across every communication frequency in known space. Every species heard it. Every world listened. You taught the galaxy that fear is the only law. You were correct. You simply chose the wrong teachers. The bombardment of the Valkyrie homeworld lasted 3 days. Cities that had stood for 10,000 years burned to ash. The great monuments of the hegemony crumbled and fell. The Black Towers where the High Council had ruled for centuries collapsed into rubble. Some called it genocide, some called it justice, most simply called it inevitable. 2 centuries later, a Valkyrie historian named Kethril published an account of his people's fall. His species was nearly extinct now. A few thousand survivors lived on reservation worlds, tolerated but never trusted. His book became required reading at universities across the galaxy. Students from 100 different species studied it to understand how the greatest empire in history had been destroyed by the species it had considered weakest. The most famous passage read, "We believed fear was universal. We believed all thinking beings could be controlled by threatening what they loved. We failed to understand that humans do not respond to fear by becoming controllable. They respond by becoming dangerous. Their love for their children is not a weakness to be exploited. It is a warning to be heeded. We did not heed it. We killed a child picking flowers, and in doing so, we killed ourselves." On New Meridian, where everything had begun, they built a memorial garden. Earth roses grew there in every color, red and pink and white and yellow. They bloomed year after year, tended by volunteers who came from across human space. In the center of the garden stood a small statue, a girl made of white stone reaching down to pick a flower. Her face was peaceful. Her eyes were closed. She looked like she was dreaming of something beautiful. The inscription beneath the statue was simple: Lily Chen, age 7, the last straw. Visitors came from across the galaxy to see it. They stood in silence and read the words. They looked at the small figure and the flower in her hand. They thought about empires and children and the price of cruelty. And they remembered the lesson that the Valkyrie had learned too late. Humans will bend and bend and bend. They will follow rules. They will bow their heads. They will seem broken and beaten and tame. But push them far enough, and they will not shatter. They will explode.